It's August 20. Ukraine Media Center continues its operations. My name is Svetlana Shiporenko, and now we will be discussing the return of Ukrainian children as one of the steps towards future peace. And joining us in the studio is Kateryna Rashevska, PhD in international law, expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights. Good afternoon, Kateryna. Good afternoon. So now the matter of bringing Ukrainian children back is a pressing one in the context of the future peace, is discussed as one of the mandatory preconditions before the peace. But let's talk about the current situation, how many children we were able to bring back for the time being, and what is the pace of their return. So officially on the platform Bring Back Kids Act, we can see this figure, 1,509 children, but to the best of my information today, another big group is coming back. So this figure is going to grow, maybe even live by the end of our conversation. It is a real positive phenomenon that makes us happy because it's a regular procedure, but it's in no way a merit of Russian Federation or all those technical consultations, peace negotiations, etc. It's a merit of the initiative itself of Bring Kids Back UA, Ukrainian Network for Children's Rights, Save Ukraine are already a member. It's also a merit of international coalition to bring Ukrainian kids back home. And we hope that the pace will be even increased. It's pretty interesting to measure it year by year, because in that platform, Children of the War, we were seeing this figure, 338. It was not changing for years. Starting from the January 2025 is more than 300 children. Talking in about 2024, the number in the coalition report is about 600 children. So generally about a couple hundred children are coming back to Ukraine on annual basis. But in this case, we're talking about 20,000 children in general. That is only a known number of the children deported. I think that everybody was able to see the so-called catalog of the children. But in fact, it's a bank of the children whose parents who were deprived of the parenting. Those are the children that the Russian authorities want to give to the Russian families. And this is an organized systemic process. It's organized in the so-called LPR. In 2025, we keep documenting those facts. When the Russians come, they pick a child, they adopt them, and they take them away to Russia. And we understand that after this process is done, it's very difficult to bring a Ukrainian child back home. And in response to our list, the Russian Federation will say that they got reunited with their family, but it was not having them united, but it's a violent handover to the Russian family. Can you tell us about some specific cases of return? Well, we understand that the Regional Center for Children's Rights, they don't bring children back themselves. This is what our partners do. But what impresses us in our work, we prepare the complaints to the United Nations Human Rights Committee on behalf of those children. And until this day, I can't stop getting surprised by the cowardness and the violence of the enemy when it comes to the subject of our children. Previously, they were imposing the citizenship, they were militarizing and indoctrinating our children. But now we document cases when the attitude to the children is such that it crossed the threshold of inhumane treatment. When children were raped, they were becoming witnesses of rape or murder of their parents. And when you read it theoretically, that's one thing. When you read it in a report by international organization, that's not a unique case. But when you hear this story, when you reread it a number of times as you prepare the report or a complaint, it's a painful experience, because I understand that 1,600,000 children are still in occupation. Now there are talks emerging that the occupied territories will remain under the control of Russian Federation. Russian Federation will not recognize such a regime of those territories. They've incorporated those regions to their constitution, according to their constitution, to their territory. And in this case, I would like to recall the ruling of the International Court for Human Rights that was considering cases of violence against children, and they ruled that there is no way to enforce international law on those territories. So it's a territory with no rule of law, where children are unprotected. The Russians started the mandatory draft in the autumn of the last year, and the formerly Ukrainian males aged 18-20 years start getting drafted. And as you analyze this information, you understand that by the moment of occupation, they were children, specifically when it comes to Crimea, Donbass, and newly occupied territories. So everything that happens in occupation for the time being, it doesn't fit in the framework of any obligations and any talks of international law. What's necessary is to have the peace negotiations also cover not only forcibly relocated children, but also cover the humanitarian guarantees for those who are in the territory under the enemy's control. And when I've said that we hope to bring more Ukrainian kids back home, it can be guaranteed thanks to the opening of the safe humanitarian corridors that would allow people to come back without any of those protracted filtration procedures, when in fact the Russians in their legislative level try to complicate the transportation out of occupation, out of Russian control, to keep those people under their jurisdiction. So talking about the peace negotiations, the talks are on initial stage, but can you state that the matter of Ukrainian kids is still on agenda? Are there any conversations in this regard, and in what context are they happening? In the context of peace negotiations, I would divide it into a number of aspects related to the best interests of our affected children, because one thing is to bring the forcibly adopted children back, or another thing is the guarantees for the children and occupation. And a whole different thing is how does this process influence the legal liability. You know, all those guarantees for Putin, please come, the arrest warrant won't be executed, please talk about peace. Meanwhile, in Rome Statute is set forth that the international war crimes are of threat to the peace. It cannot be like this, like let's talk about peace and we forget about this arrest warrant. This is a non-legal situation. It cannot be regulated in those areas of international law that all of the countries adhere to. I mean, the United States are no member of Rome Statute. We don't expect them to execute the arrest warrant. But when it comes to Switzerland, that's a whole different thing. But again, coming back to peace negotiations and bringing back Ukrainian kids, it's important to mention a number of details. First, in the beginning of the year, there was such a talk emerging that was valuable for me as a lawyer. The words of Mr. Walz, who said that bringing Ukrainian kids back home can be considered as a trust-building activity. It's a test for the Russian Federation whether they are even capable of fulfilling any of their international obligations. And now let's answer this question. In June, the list of 339 children was handed over to the Russians, and according to the statements of the Russians, they've repatriated 5. So there will be a peace agreement made up of 15 sections, and Russia will fulfill only 1 article. So we are supposed to trust them that in that case they didn't fulfill anything, and in this case they are going to act as saints. and there will be no enforcement mechanism, and there will be more talks like, oh, there are controversial obligations, or it's a bit ambiguous, and we'll end up in a situation when Russians do what they want, and we end up without children, without security guarantees, and without our lands. How is it considered currently? Well, we were not in Alaska during the meeting between Putin and Trump, but based on the public communications, we've heard nothing about having Ukrainian kids brought back home. Let alone, I cannot even pick the proper word, like weird, when after the publication about the letter handed over to Putin by from Melania Trump, that it described the abducted Ukrainian children, and then that letter was published, and there was no single word about Ukrainian kids. Well, it was a bit confusing, to say the least, because those high hopes that we were given before, we are with you until the very end, every single child should be brought back home without any additional negotiations, and then on the first steps of the distance towards peace, I cannot say it may be called peace, because it doesn't look like anything that's going to be fair and just. But anyway, I don't want to look pessimistic, because our NGOs, our government, they do everything. They take their best efforts to make sure that as much children as possible are brought back home. But talking about international framework, it's difficult to comment about any efficiency here. When it comes to Qatar mediation, well, those are diplomatic, political efforts. We appreciate it a lot, and is also a coverage of financial expenses, because I keep asking, like, why is it Russian Federation who abducted the children, and now Qatar pays for bringing them back home? You know, it's like the situation with the International Register of Losses. It was Russian Federation who inflicted the losses, but 300 billion of their frozen assets are not going to be sufficient. Probably it's going to be happening at the voluntary contributions by our partners at the expense of such contributions. It's better than nothing, but Russian Federation as a country which inflicted all that damage and loss should be brought to liability, and we should force them to be brought to liability. But currently, the situation hasn't moved a lot. Well, when it comes to the guarantees for the children in occupation, we've already discussed it, but they are not mentioned during negotiations. There are calls from non-government organizations. There is understanding on part of United Nations institutions, and I understand some may have a skeptical impression of this organization, but to say the least, when it comes to monitoring mission of United Nations in Ukraine, when it comes to independent commission on investigations, those structures, they are fighting for the guarantees of safety and security for the people under Russian occupation, but we don't see any practical reflection of it in their consultations. It's good that our president, during all these negotiations and talks with internal political context, makes it insert in one sentence that we need to have our kids brought back home, and it's good that our partners support him. European Union, I really appreciate the input of Ursula von der Leyen, who during all those negotiations with the President of America also mentioned the importance of bringing Ukrainian children back home. And you know, it looks so like everyone agrees, everyone believes that it's really necessary, that we all remember the words of Marco Rubio, who just recently mentioned that it's obvious that children are supposed to be brought back home. Well, it's obvious for everybody. There's a lot of political statements, declarations, communiques. So where are we going to start bringing children back in thousands? Well, previously we were asking, is Ukrainian ready? Yes, we are. As we were talking, we got ready. Now it's time to act, and it's important to press on Russian Federation without dancing around the president of Russian Federation. So do we have any other levers of influence over Russian Federation? We understand that it's them who don't want to bring Ukrainian kids back home. What do we have left? Well, there might be a couple of strategies that can be implemented in parallel, jointly, or a priority can be given to one of them. First is the economic pressure. So imposition of more and more sanctions. Unfortunately, in the year 2025, we see that the sanctions are not being imposed on those persons who support the abduction of Ukrainian kids. The non-support of repatriation is already a war crime. It could be a ground for imposition of sanctions, but it's not being used. Another strategy is try to agree. Definitely, children cannot be a subject of bargain. Children are not being exchanged against other children or the prisoners of war. Is prohibited by international humanitarian law. But trying to agree, well, I don't believe in it. But theoretically, I understand that some leaders of foreign countries, they still hope to agree with Putin on something. And we can continue touching upon this topic of bringing Ukrainian kids back home within the framework of other negotiations, and to carefully look at what Russians return in response to those lists, because explanation like a child has achieved an age of 18 years, it's about nothing. You've deported a person when they haven't achieved that age. You are still obliged to bring them back. And the delay of repatriation is a war crime. It's about the civilians. It's not like about children only. There is obligation existing. So why are those children who ended up under Russian control as a result of the war crime, why are they still staying there? That's unclear. Moreover, in our head, we have to put together a picture like those boys that achieved an age of 18 years, they are being drafted in Russia. Such military service was recognized by international law as a forced mobilization. So those children who are not children anymore, who are adults already, they are exposed to the risk of a war crime being committed against them. So what's important is a technical conversation. We talk a lot on a political level, but the discussion should be instrumentalized. What Ukraine does, handing over the list, is a good example of such instrumentalization of a technical approach to the business. There is a list, the list specific keys, there is a time when they were deported, there is understanding of circumstances, how it happened, and there is the demand to bring them back. This is our approach, and the Russian approach is such to lie about why children ended up under their control, then to lie that these children don't exist. For example, in case of Kherson Children's Home, that was complete lie. We understand that no one was taking those children from under occupation except for so-called foster parents from Russia. Those people don't exist in the EU, neither in Ukraine. And if they don't stay in Russia after deportation to Russia, it means that Russia is involved in human trafficking and should be accused of that on top of other crimes they've committed. Maybe I use a lot of legal language, but in his last interview, Maria Lvova-Belova quite illustratively demonstrated the position of Russian Federation when she, in her speculations, achieved an apogee, saying that there was no even evacuation, so children ended up under control of the Russians because there was such confusion. It was unclear why. It was like Russia started an aggression, but they were never going to mention it. It just something happened, and 700,000 Ukrainian children ended up under the control of the Russians, and they have no intention to bring them back. We don't see any such intentions. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions?
Me?
Yes.
Tonia Mastrobuoni. I'm a correspondent for Italian Daily della La Repubblica. I have two questions. The first is I don't understand what was the issue with the Melania Trump's letter. If you can explain it again, maybe in detail. And then could you explain to us if the Vatican had any positive role in these, we know that Cardinal Zuppi went to Russia, went to Moscow, and if they're having still a role in this negotiations. Thank you.
So,
Ви можете українською.
Добре.
Well, now when it comes to Melania Trump's letter, it's wonderful. Very good words in a very motherly way, very kind to protect the children who are affected by the armed conflict. And there is zero words about children abducted by Putin. So what's the problem with this letter? There is no problem. The problem is that we had high expectations that probably if not a president of the USA during his meeting with Putin, at least his wife could address Putin. Arrest warrant is issued in whose name? With the call to bring Ukrainian kids back home. It's not a critic of Melania Trump's letter. That was a wonderful humanitarian initiative, but it's not sufficient to make the conditions of Ukrainian kids who were abducted better. Talking about Vatican's role, it was incredibly important during the rule. I don't know whether I can use this word, the rule of the Pope Francis, when those children were returned with the support of Vatican, whom Russians were keeping under their control, who were forcibly handed over to Russian families. Those children were fleeing. They were detained in the border, brought back to Russia, and thanks to Vatican, we were able to bring them back. But after the accession of Pope Leo, his statements about Ukrainian children, they give us a lot of hope. He has a strong position to protect children against the war. It's really inspiring, but in practice, neither Ukraine nor Russian Federation ever stated that in the year 2025, at least one group of children were returned with the mediation of the Vatican. Probably those efforts will be renewed, but for the time being, the only mediator is Qatar. And South African Republic was also expressing their desire to help. Our president handed over a children list to President Ramaphosa. Hopefully, South Africa handed it over to Russian Federation. However, unfortunately, we don't know about any successful efforts of South African Republic as a mediator. Thank you. Do we have any more questions on the floor?
Italian journalist, Lorenzo Cremonesi from Corriere della Sera. Sorry, it's the same question I asked you already in the past when we participate to your conferences. About the numbers. Before at the beginning you mentioned 1,509 children who came back, right? And today you mentioned there are some children who are coming back. Do you have an idea how many?
I know, but I am not sure that I can share this number. It is more than 10.
Well, so that
And less than...
And less than 15.
Okay. So will be about 1,530, 25, something like that. These are the children who came back from the beginning of the war, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then you say two numbers. You gave two figures. 20,000 deported, right? And that is a number that is consistent with the past. You already said in the past. 20,000 children, mainly from Crimea and then Mariupol. This is including 2014 and 2022, right?
According to official statements, yes.
Right. But then you gave another number, 1,600,000 in the occupied territories. So from Crimea, etc. But of course, we presume this 20,000. What is the difference between this 20,000 is 1 million, and sorry, and this 1,600,000? I think there is a difference, right? How many children are you waiting at the moment? That's the final question. Because when you give 20,000, then you mean two. And then, sorry, I have a last question concerning figures. If, there's a big if, Ukraine give back all the Donbass, give back, surrender all the Donbass, how many children you estimate will be taken by the Russians?
It's a very hard question because, first of all, many children who are now near the front line, they are evacuated, including forcibly evacuated under special proceedings elaborated by Ukrainian government. And that is why we hope that mostly children will be under Ukrainian control just in order to avoid the Russification and also just in order to avoid the deportation to the territory of the Russian Federation. As for these two numbers, 19,546 and 1,600,000, it is very difficult to tell how we can compare them because this almost 20,000, this is statistics provided by Ukrainian government without any difference between children who were deported and who were forcibly transferred. And that is why we just don't understand among these 1,600,000 how many children were forcibly displaced through occupied territories of Ukraine. And how many should be not taken from 20,000 because they are now in Russia, in 57 subjects of the Russian Federation. So I will not answer the first question because it is just impossible and very difficult. But regardless numbers, I would like to tell that first of all, 20,000, this is not the final number, and I'm sure that you have seen the interviews of Nathaniel Raymond from the Yale Humanitarian Laboratory with a very different figure, like almost 30,000 Ukrainian children who were abducted by Russians. So it is higher than 20,000. And also all the statements of Russian authorities about more than 700,000 Ukrainian children who crossed the border of the Russian Federation after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So it is very difficult to counter, but we hope that the process of repatriation will be ongoing and we will return at least thousands of them.
Your next question, please.
Yes, hello, Per Anders Johansen from Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten. As you mentioned, many of these children that was abducted are now older. They are above 18 years. Can you say something more about how many we are talking about, and have you been able to do some more systematic work on trying to find out how many of them that are now drafted and sent into the Russian army? There have been very good Ukrainian investigations of it, but have you been able to do more systematic work on about how many of them who is now, in fact, in Russian arms?
So it is maybe one of the biggest problems of Ukrainian statistics that we can see only number without any differentiation as for gender, as for age. And that is why I cannot answer how many children are now adults and they still be under Russian control as a result of deportation or forcible transfer. However, as for people who were drafted in newly occupied territories, there is some data provided by occupation authorities. In autumn 2024, this was 200 people. And in spring 2025, it was 400 people. As for the occupied Crimean Peninsula, the number is really high. We are talking about 55,000 Crimeans who were drafted. during the period 2014-2025. So thanks for Ukrainians forcibly circumscribed or mobilized, they are covering a big part of their mobilization reserve, actually. It was one of their goals of the occupation of Ukrainian territories to solve their own demographic problems, including everything related to the mobilization potential.
Дякую. Можливо, є ще запитання?
Thank you. Do we have any more questions on the floor?
Facebook a couple of days ago, how it was for you, who has been working with all the details, the reports, the individual stories, to sit and watch the meetings in Alaska. Could you tell a little bit more about what you felt when you were seeing Putin on the red carpet and the American soldiers putting down the carpet?
It was awful. You know, it was in midnight, and I was just not able to sleep after all this news and photos. So at this moment, I have been working on individual complaint to the United Nations Human Rights Committee on behalf of a 9-year boy who testified the killing of his mother. And there was any punishment for people who killed her. And to see this red carpet, all this handshaking, and just normalization of Putin, who allowed these Russian killers to do what they did. So it is not about my feelings. This is about feelings and sentiments of all Ukrainians. Justice was promised to us. We are ready to fight for justice. We are doing our best. But all these conferences, meetings, without any clear results, frankly speaking, we have shellings after these negotiations. So civilians are killed, including children, but it was promised that maybe, Putin stopped attack civilians. Not, he didn't stop. But the legitimization of his actions, at least partially, happened. So it was really sad.
Дякую. Чи є ще запитання? Дякую, пані Катерино.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Well, if not, then thank you, Ms. Kateryna. Let me remind you that we were discussing the return of Ukrainian kids as one of the steps in the peaceful process, and we'll continue at 1400. We'll have a presentation of documenting of war crimes in Chernihiv region and cluster munition attacks in Chernihiv. Thank you. Stay tuned.